There are moments in life that seem completely absurd when you try to explain them to someone who wasn't there. Moments where you step back, look at what's happening, and genuinely wonder if you've slipped sideways into some alternate universe where common sense has been replaced with laminated rule sheets and passive-aggressive sticky notes. For me, one of those moments happened on the coldest morning of the year, when I was crouched down beside my foundation wall in about 6 inches of fresh snow, holding a perfectly legal propane torch, trying to thaw my frozen hose bib before the pipe behind it cracked and turned my basement into an indoor swimming pool. And that's when Linda Sinclair came marching across my yard in a puffy purple coat, waving her arms like she was trying to flag down a rescue plane. That was the beginning of one of the most ridiculous, frustrating, and ultimately satisfying fights I have ever had in my life. And trust me, I've had some fights. My name is Rick Morgan. I've lived in Maplecrest Commons for going on 7 years now. It's a nice enough neighborhood, all things considered. Good neighbors, decent-sized lots, mature trees lining the streets. In winter, those trees look genuinely beautiful when they're frosted over. The kind of thing you'd see on a Christmas card. The subdivision has an HOA, which I knew going in. I'm not someone who hates the entire concept of homeowner associations. I get it. You want people to maintain their properties, keep the neighborhood looking decent, preserve property values. Fine. I understand the purpose. What I never understood, and still don't, is how an HOA can attract a certain type of person who takes a volunteer position with the kind of intensity and personal investment normally reserved for running a small country. And in Maplecrest Commons, that person was Linda Sinclair. Linda had been on the HOA board for 4 years by the time this story took place. She had started as a general board member, then worked her way into the role of compliance chair, which she had apparently invented for herself, and pushed through at an annual meeting that about 12 people attended. As compliance chair, Linda's self-appointed job was to find violations. She drove through the neighborhood with a notepad. She took photographs. She sent certified letters. She knocked on doors at inconvenient hours to deliver printed notices in little plastic sleeves, the kind you'd expect to find on a hotel door handle. She clearly loved it. This was her hobby, her purpose, her identity. Linda Sinclair, compliance chair of Maplecrest Commons HOA, protector of the covenant, guardian of the aesthetic standard. I had run-ins with her before this whole propane torch situation, but nothing major. She once left me a notice because my recycling bin was 6 inches past the edge of my garage door instead of fully inside the garage. 6 inches. She had measured. Another time she flagged my fence because one of the pickets had a small crack and she declared it a structural defect, which was genuinely laughable to anyone who looked at it. I handled those things with gritted teeth and a polite email response. You pick your battles. I had learned that much. But this situation was different. It happened on a Thursday in late January. We had gotten hit with a serious cold snap the week before, temperatures dropping down to about 9 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and barely cracking 20 during the day. The kind of cold that makes your face hurt the moment you step outside, that makes your car groan when you start it, that freezes the puddles in your driveway into little skating rinks by 7 in the morning. The snow had been coming in waves all month. We had about 1.5 feet total on the ground by that point, packed and crusted on top, with another 3 or 4 inches of fresh powder from the storm that had rolled through Tuesday night. The roads in Maplecrest Commons were a mess. The HOA was supposed to contract with a snow removal company to clear the main roads through the subdivision, and that contract had apparently been a source of drama all its own since before I moved in. But more on that later. My immediate problem that Thursday morning was my hose bib. For those who don't know, a hose bib is just the outdoor faucet mounted on the exterior wall of your house, the thing you connect your garden hose to in summer. Most modern ones are frost-free, meaning the valve mechanism sits further back inside the wall where it's warmer. Mine was an older style that the previous owner had never replaced. I knew it was a weak point going into every winter. I had a foam insulating cap on it, the little rubber-lined cover you can get at any hardware store for about $3. That cap had been doing its job for 6 years. But this particular cold snap was unusually brutal and extended, and when I went out to check on things Thursday morning, I could see that the bib was solidly frozen. The metal was crusted with a thin skin of ice, and when I gently tried the handle, it wouldn't budge even a millimeter. The reason this mattered urgently was not just inconvenience. When water freezes inside a pipe, it expands. That expansion puts enormous pressure on the pipe walls. The pipe doesn't always crack at the frozen point itself. Sometimes it cracks behind the wall inside the basement, where you won't discover it until the ice thaws and suddenly you have water pouring into your finished basement. I had a finished basement. I had a home theater set up down there, a decent amount of furniture, flooring I'd invested real money into. The idea of letting that pipe sit frozen and risk a crack was not acceptable to me, so I did what any reasonably handy homeowner would do. I went to my garage, got my propane torch, which I had owned for years and used for various plumbing tasks and soldering projects, and I went to work. Using a torch to thaw a frozen pipe or hose bib is a standard technique. Any plumber worth anything will use exactly this method in this exact situation. You move the flame in slow, steady passes along the frozen section. You keep the heat moving. You don't dwell in one spot. It's controlled, deliberate, and effective. I was wearing heavy work gloves and safety glasses. I was crouched down in the snow in my heavy insulated work pants and a Carhartt jacket, operating the torch at the base of my house on my own foundation, on my own property. I had been at it maybe 4 minutes when I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow behind me. "Rick Morgan, what are you doing?" I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. That voice had a very specific pitch, slightly nasal, with an undertone of someone who had already decided they were right about whatever came next. I turned around anyway, because ignoring Linda Sinclair has never once made her go away. She was standing about 15 feet away, hands on her hips, purple puffy coat zipped up to her chin, a bright orange knitted hat pulled down over her ears. She was holding her phone in one hand and what appeared to be her compliance notebook in the other. It was barely 8 in the morning. Apparently Linda had been up early. "Morning, Linda," I said and turned back to the pipe. "I asked what you're doing," she said. "Thawing my hose bib," I said. "It froze last night. I'm preventing a burst pipe." She walked a few steps closer, crunching through the snow, and I could hear the disapproval radiating off her even before she spoke again. "You cannot use an open flame on or near the structure," she said. "That is a direct violation of Section 7, Article 4 of the Maplecrest Commons HOA Community Standards." I moved the torch slowly along the pipe fitting, watching the frost begin to soften. "I'll look that up when I'm done," I said. "You will stop now," she said. "You are creating a fire hazard." "I'm using a propane torch on a metal pipe in the middle of winter, surrounded by snow," I said. "The fire hazard concern is pretty minimal, Linda." "The foundation is treated wood in some areas," she said. "The foundation is poured concrete," I said. "I've been in this house 7 years." "Nevertheless," she said, and there was that word, the great lever of people who have run out of logic and want to keep the argument going anyway. "I am officially noting this violation. You need to stop immediately and contact a licensed plumber." I took a breath. The cold air stung my lungs a little. I heard the quiet, satisfying drip of the first meltwater starting to work its way out around the bib fitting. "The pipe is already thawing," I said. "I'll be done in another 2 minutes. "Rick," she said, and there was a shift in her tone now, like she was doing me a favor by being reasonable. "I'm trying to help you avoid a fine. Section 7, Article 4 is very clear about open flame devices within 15 feet of any structure." "Does Section 7, Article 4 apply to gas grills?" I asked because I already knew the answer. Half the people on my street had propane grills on their decks, inches from their siding. I had never seen Linda cite a single one of them. There was a pause. "That's different," she said. "How?" I asked. Another pause. "Grills are used for cooking. This is different." "Both involve propane," I said. "Both involve an open flame near a structure. The difference is this one is actually preventing property damage." I could hear her writing in her notebook, the scratch of a pen even out here in the cold. "You'll be receiving a formal notice," she said. "Fine," I said. "I need you to stop now, Rick." I stood up. The hose bib was fully thawed at this point. I could feel the handle turn freely when I touched it, and the drip of meltwater confirmed the ice had released. I turned off the torch, capped it, and looked at Linda. "All done," I said. "Have a great morning." She gave me a long, hard look, wrote something else in her notebook, took a photograph of me holding the torch, and then turned and crunched back across my yard toward the street. I watched her go, tucked the torch under my arm, and went back inside to pour a cup of coffee and think about what was coming next. What came next was a formal notice, which arrived in my mailbox 3 days later in one of Linda's signature little plastic sleeves. I had to give her credit for the production value. The notice was printed on HOA letterhead, had a violation number on it, cited Section 7, Article 4 of the Community Standards, described the incident with the kind of deadpan formality that made it sound like I had been caught running a flamethrower through the neighborhood, and informed me that I had 14 days to respond in writing and confirm compliance or face a fine of $100 per day. $100 per day. For thawing my own frozen pipe on my own foundation. I sat down at my kitchen table, put the notice in front of me, and read it 3 times. Then I went and pulled up my copy of the Maplecrest Commons HOA Community Standards, which I had downloaded when I first moved in and never deleted, because even then I had a feeling I'd need it someday. I found Section 7. I found Article 4. Section 7, Article 4 of the actual document read as follows. The use of open flame devices for recreational purposes, including but not limited to fire pits, fire bowls, chimeneas, or similar backyard fire features, is permitted only with prior written approval from the board and must comply with all applicable local fire codes. That was it. That was the whole article. Nothing about propane torches. Nothing about maintenance work. Nothing about the structure itself. It was specifically about recreational open flame features, the kind of thing people set up in their backyards for ambience. Fire pits, chimeneas, decorative fire bowls. It had absolutely nothing, not one syllable, to do with using a torch to perform plumbing maintenance. I read it again just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Nope. Linda had either completely misread the rule she was citing, or she had read it and was hoping I wouldn't bother to look it up. I picked up my phone and called my neighbor Dave, who lived 2 houses down. Dave was a retired contractor, one of those guys who had spent decades building and fixing things, and had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of construction and building codes. He was also the kind of person who paid close attention to how the HOA operated because he had his own history with Linda Sinclair, which involved a fence permit dispute that had lasted 11 months and ended in Linda backing down so fast, she practically skidded across the pavement. She cited Section 7, Article 4, Dave said when I told him. I could hear him laughing quietly on his end of the phone. "Rick, that's the backyard fire pit rule. She's either confused or she's bluffing." "She's definitely bluffing," I said. "Write her a letter back," Dave said. "Quote the actual text of the rule. Ask her specifically which clause prohibits maintenance torch work. Watch what happens." "What do you think will happen?" I asked. "She'll either manufacture something new or she'll go quiet for a bit," Dave said. "Either way, document everything." That was good advice. I had already started a folder on my laptop. I had the original notice saved. I had a photo of the hose bib before and after thawing. I had a photo of the ice and frost conditions that morning. I even had a saved weather report showing the overnight temperature. I wrote my response letter that afternoon, kept it completely professional and calm, and sent it back via certified mail. In the letter I quoted Section 7, Article 4 verbatim noted that the language specifically applied to recreational fire features and contained no language pertaining to maintenance work on utility fixtures, and asked Linda to identify the specific clause she believed I had violated. I also noted politely that propane torch use for plumbing maintenance was a standard industry practice documented in multiple published trade guides and was not subject to any local fire code restriction in our municipality, which I confirmed with a quick call to the city's building department that morning. The building department woman I spoke to was very helpful and slightly baffled by why I was asking. I also made a quiet note in my folder that I wanted to talk to a few more neighbors, not to start anything, just to understand the scope of what Linda was doing, because something Dave had said stuck with me. He had said that the fence permit dispute had lasted 11 months. 11 months is a long time for a fence dispute. That implied Linda hadn't just been annoying. She had been persistent, and persistent people in positions of even small authority can do real damage if left unchecked. Over the following week, while I waited to see what Linda's response to my letter would be, I started having some conversations. My neighbor on the other side, a woman named Carol who taught high school chemistry, told me she'd gotten 2 notices in the past year. One for a bird feeder she had hung from a shepherd's hook in her side yard, which Linda claimed was an unauthorized structure. The other for a holiday wreath she had kept on her front door 3 weeks past the date Linda had decided was acceptable. Both had resulted in fines she had paid just to make the thing go away. Carol was quietly furious about it. Down the block, a younger couple named Travis and Nadia had received a notice for their basketball hoop, which was a freestanding portable unit on their driveway, not even permanently installed. Linda had cited it as a violation of the No Permanent Structures in Driveways rule, freestanding and portable. They'd received a $100 fine. There was also the situation with Gary Whitmore, who was an older gentleman who lived on the corner and had just returned from 3 weeks visiting family in Arizona. Gary came home to find a notice on his door citing him for failing to clear snow from his driveway within 24 hours of a snowfall. Gary had been in Arizona. He had arranged for a service to come clear his driveway, but they had missed a visit during the worst of the snowfall. Linda had fined him $75. Gary was 81 years old. I started keeping a log. Neighbor, incident, fine amount, whether the fine had been paid, and whether the cited rule actually applied in each case. It was slow work, but by the time I had talked to 8 different households in the immediate area, the picture was getting pretty clear. Linda was citing rules creatively, sometimes outright incorrectly, and generating fines. The HOA collected those fines, and the HOA budget, which was supposed to be used for things like road maintenance and the snow removal contract, was somehow perpetually underfunded, with regular assessments going up year after year. The snow removal issue was its own story. For the 3rd year running, the HOA's contract with the plowing company had been awarded to a company called Clearway Property Services. Clearway's work in Maplecrest Commons had been, to put it charitably, inconsistent. They would show up hours after a storm, sometimes only partially clear the roads, and on at least 2 occasions this winter hadn't shown up at all until residents started calling the management company. Meanwhile, the roads in our subdivision were genuinely dangerous. I had seen 2 fender benders already this winter on the main loop road that ran through the neighborhood, both in spots where packed ice had been left uncleared for days. I started looking into Clearway Property Services. It took about 45 minutes of public record searching and some basic internet digging. What I found was interesting. Clearway Property Services was owned by a man named Dennis Payne. Dennis Payne's wife was Corinne Payne. Corinne Payne was Linda Sinclair's sister. Now that right there made my eye twitch, I'll tell you that much. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not an idiot. An HOA board member steering a contract to a company owned by her own brother-in-law without disclosing that relationship is a serious conflict of interest. In many states, it's not just a civil matter, it's potentially a breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on how the money moved and whether Linda had actually voted on the contract award, it could be quite a bit worse than that. I called Dave. "I know about the Clearway connection," Dave said before I could even get the words out. "I've known for about 2 years. I've been waiting for someone else to notice." "Why didn't you do anything?" I asked. "I didn't have enough," Dave said. "I had the relationship but not the money trail. Do you have the contract terms?" "Not yet," I said, "but I know someone who might be able to get them." The HOA's governing documents required that certain financial records be available to homeowners upon written request. I put in a written request that afternoon for the past 3 years of snow removal contracts, the vendor selection records, and the board meeting minutes for any meeting where the snow removal vendor had been discussed or voted on. I sent it to the HOA management company, which was a third-party administrator, not Linda herself. I worded the request very carefully, cited the specific provision of the governing documents that entitled homeowners to this information, and gave them 14 days to respond. While I waited on that, Linda responded to my letter. Her response was 4 pages long. I give her credit for effort. In those 4 pages, she argued that Section 7, Article 4 should be interpreted broadly to include any open flame device used in proximity to a structure, that this broad interpretation was consistent with the, quote, spirit and intent of the community standards, that my use of the torch constituted a safety risk to neighboring properties, and that the fine stood. She also added a new notice, freshly minted, citing me under a completely different rule this time. She had gone and found Section 3, Article 9, which pertained to contractor work performed on properties in the community, and claimed that since I was performing what she characterized as a plumbing repair, I was required to use a licensed contractor and had violated the rule by doing the work myself. I read that part twice and then called my neighbor Carol, who I was starting to think of as an unofficial advisor. "She just told you that you were required to hire a plumber to thaw your frozen pipe," Carol said slowly. "That's correct," I said. "A plumber who would have done the exact same thing with the exact same torch," Carol said. "In theory, yes," I said. There was a beat of silence, and then Carol started laughing, the kind of slightly helpless laugh that means something has moved from frustrating into genuinely absurd. I laughed too, because honestly, what else could you do? But I was also genuinely angry, and I want to be honest about that, because this wasn't just about me at this point. Gary Whitmore was 81 years old and had been fined for missing snow clearance while he was out of state. Carol had been fined over a bird feeder. Travis and Nadia had been fined over a portable basketball hoop. These were real people being squeezed out of real money by someone who was abusing a volunteer position and very possibly routing HOA contract money to her own family while doing it. That's not just annoying. That's genuinely wrong. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a real estate attorney I knew from a previous job who had specific experience with HOA governance disputes. Her name was Sandra Elliott, and the first thing she said when I described the situation was, "Okay, you've got the misapplied rules, potentially the contractor interpretation, and what sounds like a conflict of interest on the vendor contract. Have you put anything in writing that could be used against you?" "I've been very polite in all my written communications," I said. "Good. Keep doing that," she said. "The people who win these fights are the ones who are boring and professional in writing and save the actual opinions for phone calls and coffee conversations." Sandra confirmed what I suspected about the conflict of interest. In our state, HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the interests of the community. Steering a contract to a family member without disclosure, or voting on a contract where you have a personal financial interest, constitutes a breach of that duty. If money had actually been misallocated or overcharged, it could rise to the level of fraud. She told me to get the financial records I'd requested, and to start building a paper trail on the fine collection specifically, Because if the fines weren't being properly documented and accounted for in the HOA's books, that was another thread worth pulling. The HOA management company responded to my records request on day 12. They sent me the snow removal contracts for the past 3 years, the vendor selection records, and the board meeting minutes I had asked for. I printed everything out, made 2 copies, put one in my safe, emailed one to Sandra, and started reading. The contracts were illuminating. In year 1, Clearway Property Services had bid $43,000 for the season's snow removal contract for Maplecrest Commons. There had been one other bidder, a company called Northstar Grounds, which had bid $38,000. The board meeting minutes showed a motion to award the contract to Clearway rather than the lower bidder. The reason given in the minutes was, and I'm quoting directly, superior responsiveness and community familiarity. Northstar had been the previous vendor and had no complaints on record. Linda had made the motion to award to Clearway. Linda had voted in favor. The minutes contained no disclosure of any relationship between Linda and the principals of Clearway. Year 2, Clearway bid $47,000. No competitive bidding had been sought. The minutes showed a motion to renew with Clearway made by Linda, voted on by Linda. Still no disclosure. Year 3, this current season, Clearway had been awarded a contract at $51,000. Again, sole source, no competitive bid. Again, Linda made the motion. Again, Linda voted in favor. The HOA dues for the community had gone up twice in the past 3 years. Sandra called me after she reviewed the documents. Her voice had that very particular calm tone that lawyers get when they're actually excited about something but are too professional to show it directly. "This is a pattern," she said. 3 years, sole source contracts awarded to a company owned by your board member's brother-in-law, with that board member voting on each award and no disclosure anywhere in the minutes. The cost escalation over 3 years is 39%. That's not inflation. That's not material cost increases. That's a relationship being leveraged for financial benefit. What can we actually do about it? I asked. "A few things," Sandra said. The HOA board itself can be petitioned for a special meeting if you get signatures from enough homeowners. How many properties are in your community? "About 230, I think," I said. "You'll need 10% in most standard governing documents," she said. "That's 23 households. Can you get that?" "Easily," I said. "Get 50, Sandra said. "Don't show up to a meeting with the minimum, show up with a crowd." I spent the next 10 days talking to neighbors. I went door to door on weekends, walking through the snow in my heavy boots, knocking on doors, having conversations. Most people already had grievances. Many of them had just paid their fines and grumbled quietly to themselves, the way you do when you're not sure if fighting back is worth the trouble. I showed them the information I had gathered. Not the full financial records, because I wanted to be careful about what I shared before the meeting, but the pattern of the fines, the nature of the violations, and the simple, publicly verifiable fact that Linda Sinclair had voted to award a significant contract to her brother-in-law's company 3 years in a row without disclosing the relationship. People got very engaged, very quickly. By the end of the week, I had 64 signatures on a petition requesting a special meeting of the Homeowners Association to discuss board conduct, vendor contract practices, and compliance enforcement procedures. 64. Out of about 230 households, that was more than a quarter. It was overwhelming. I submitted the petition to the HOA management company, which was legally required to convene the meeting within 30 days. The petition cited the specific provision of the governing documents authorizing homeowner-requested special meetings, identified the agenda items, and was submitted with all 64 signatures with addresses attached. Now here's where things got interesting, because apparently someone tipped off Linda about the petition before the management company had formally notified the board. I don't know who it was. Maybe someone at the management company. Maybe a board member who had been given a heads up. Whatever the case, Linda showed up at my door the day after I submitted the petition. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had just come in from shoveling my front walk, which had gotten another 2 inches of snow overnight, and I was standing in my kitchen unwrapping my scarf when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there she was. Purple coat, orange hat, the same combination as always. But this time there was no notebook. Her hands were at her sides and her expression was different, less official, more calculating. "Rick," she said. "Linda," I said. She stood there for a moment in the cold. Wind was blowing a little and it ruffled the edges of her coat. The street behind her was still only partially cleared, Clearway having done their typical half-effort job. "I know about the petition," she said. "It's a public document," I said. "It was submitted through the proper channel." "You're stirring up the neighborhood over a minor violation," she said. "You could have just paid the fine." "The fine was for something that wasn't actually a violation," I said. "And when I tried to address that through proper channels, you added a second violation that was equally unsupported by the actual rules." "I have a responsibility to this community," she said. "So do I said. "I live here." She shifted her weight. The temperature out there had to be in the mid-20s and I could see her breath coming out in little puffs. "If you withdraw the petition," she said, "I'll drop the violation. The fines, all of it gone, clean slate." I looked at her for a long moment. In the silence, I could hear the distant sound of a snowblower somewhere down the block. "That's not what this is about anymore, Linda," I said. Her expression tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means the petition isn't about my fines," I said. "It's about the conduct of the board, all of it. That's what the homeowners who signed it care about." There was a beat of quiet. "You're making a mistake," she said. "I'll take my chances," I said. She left. I closed the door and stood in my warm kitchen for a minute thinking about what her coming here actually meant. It meant she was worried. And when someone in a position like Linda's starts acting worried, they start making mistakes. She made one about 4 days later. A neighbor named Patricia, who lived on the east loop of the subdivision, called me one evening and told me that Linda had come to her door. Linda had asked Patricia to sign a counter-petition supporting the board's actions, specifically Linda's compliance work, and had suggested that if Patricia didn't sign, her property might receive closer scrutiny in the coming season. Patricia had an older deck that needed some work, and Linda had apparently gestured at that specifically while making the suggestion. Patricia had, very wisely, recorded the conversation on her phone. I called Sandra the next morning. Sandra was quiet for a moment after I told her. She threatened a homeowner with regulatory action in exchange for a political favor, she said. "That's what it sounds like," I said. "That's coercion," Sandra said. "At minimum, it's tortious. Depending on the specifics of your state's HOA statutes, it could be criminal. Does Patricia have the recording?" "She does," I said. "She needs to keep it safe and be prepared to share it with me," Sandra said. "Don't post it online, don't circulate it, keep it clean." I texted Patricia and gave her Sandra's contact information. Patricia called Sandra that same afternoon and sent her the audio file. Sandra listened to it and told me we were potentially looking at extortion under our state's statutes, which carried real legal weight. The next 10 days were busy. Sandra sent a formal letter to the HOA board, not just Linda but all 5 board members, putting them on notice about the coercion allegation and the conflict of interest in the vendor contracts. The letter was precise and calm and laid out exactly what we had, which was the recording, the contract documents, the voting records, and a clear pattern across 3 years. The letter informed the board that the homeowners involved were prepared to seek legal remedies if the conduct did not stop, and if the special meeting was not convened as required by the governing documents. 2 of the board members, a man named Frank and a woman named Diane, called the HOA management company the day after receiving Sandra's letter. Frank called me directly the following day. He sounded tired and a little scared. "I want you to know that I wasn't part of any of this," Frank said. "The Clearway contract, Linda's compliance approach, I voted on those things because she presented them as routine and I didn't dig into the details. That's on me and I own that. But I didn't know about the relationship with her sister. I believe you, Frank, I said, and I actually did. I think you and Diane and the others have an opportunity here to do the right thing. Come to the special meeting. Be honest about what you knew and when. The homeowners aren't looking to burn everyone. They want accountability and reform. Frank and Diane both ended up cooperating. They produced their own board communications, internal emails between board members, which showed that Linda had driven the vendor decisions essentially unilaterally and had never mentioned her family connection. Those emails were damning in a quiet, bureaucratic way. They showed Linda saying things like, "Clearway is a known quantity. I'll handle the renewal," and "I've already confirmed pricing with Clearway. Let's move forward." The other board members had largely deferred to her on these items because she presented herself as having the most detailed knowledge of HOA operations. The special meeting was convened on a Tuesday evening in mid-February. It was cold outside, maybe 17 degrees, the kind of cold where your eyelashes frost over if you stand outside for more than a minute. The meeting was held in the community room of the neighborhood's small clubhouse. I had expected maybe 40 or 50 people to show up. The room filled to capacity. People were standing along the walls. I counted heads as best I could and got to roughly 115 before I lost track. More than half of those had come through the cold specifically because they were angry and they wanted answers. Linda was there. She came in about 5 minutes before the meeting started, wearing a gray blazer over a turtleneck instead of her usual outdoor gear, apparently trying to project a more official image. She sat at the board table at the front of the room with Frank, Diane, and the other 2 board members. She had a pile of papers in front of her and a pen in her hand. The HOA management company had sent a representative, a man named Paul, to run the meeting per the governing documents. Paul was clearly not thrilled to be there and clearly understood that this was not going to be a routine quarterly meeting. He called the meeting to order, established a quorum, and opened the floor to homeowner comments on the petition items. Sandra was there as my legal advisor, seated next to me. She wasn't speaking at the meeting, just present for support and observation, but her presence was noted. Linda noticed. I saw her eyes go to Sandra when we walked in. The homeowner comments went for about an hour and 40 minutes. People talked about the fines they had received. They talked about violations that didn't match the rules cited. They talked about the snow removal problems, the dangerous roads, the late response times. Gary Whitmore, 81 years old, stood up and spoke quietly and clearly about being fined for snow that hadn't been cleared from his driveway while he was visiting his grandchildren in Arizona, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room. Then I presented the vendor contract information. I walked through the 3 years of contracts, the sole source awards, the voting record, the price escalation, and the family relationship between Linda Sinclair and Dennis Payne of Clearway Property Services. I put a simple chart up on the projector screen the management company rep had set up. Plain, factual, clear. Linda spoke up from the board table. Those contracts were awarded based on performance. Clearway missed 2 service visits during our worst storm of the season, I said. There are 2 car accidents on our loop road this winter that can be directly attributed to uncleared ice. Does that meet your definition of performance? There was a murmur through the room. You don't have any proof of a relationship, Linda said. Dennis Payne's wife is Corinne Payne, your sister, I said. I have their marriage certificate, which is a public document. I have your sister's social media profile where she and Dennis are listed as married. And I have 3 years of board minutes showing you making and seconding motions to award contracts to his company without any disclosure of that relationship. She didn't have a response to that. She just sat very still. Paul, the management company rep, looked deeply uncomfortable but kept the meeting running. At the appropriate point, Patricia stood up and with Sandra's guidance presented a summary of the coercion incident. She didn't play the recording at the meeting on Sandra's advice, but she described clearly what had happened, what Linda had said, and confirmed that a recording existed. The room got very quiet for a moment. Then it got very loud. It took Paul about 3 minutes to get everyone settled back down. When he did, Frank stood up at the board table. He looked at Linda, then at the room. "I want to address this community directly," Frank said. "I serve on this board as a volunteer, and I take that responsibility seriously. Based on what has been presented tonight, including information I have reviewed personally over the past 2 weeks, I am calling for Linda Sinclair's immediate resignation from the compliance chair position and from the board. I am also calling for the board to immediately seek legal counsel and self-report the vendor relationship issue to our state's HOA regulatory authority." Diane seconded both items. Linda sat at that table and didn't move for a long moment. Then she picked up her papers, stood up, and walked out. She didn't say a word. She just left. The room sat with that for a second, and then someone in the back started clapping, and then the whole room was clapping. I won't pretend that was the end of it entirely, because it wasn't. Real life is messier than that. But here's what happened after the meeting. Sandra filed a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory authority on behalf of the homeowner group. The complaint detailed the conflict of interest, the improper contract awards, and the coercion allegation. The regulatory authority opened an investigation within 2 weeks. The police were involved too, specifically because of the coercion incident with Patricia. Sandra reviewed the recording with an attorney experienced in criminal law, and they agreed it was strong enough to support a complaint under our state's extortion statute, which covered threats of official action used to compel someone to perform or refrain from a political act. Patricia filed a police report. The detective who was assigned to it interviewed Patricia, listened to the recording, and then went to interview Linda. Linda retained a lawyer and declined to speak to police initially. The investigation took about 6 weeks. At the end of those 6 weeks, the district attorney's office determined they had sufficient evidence to charge Linda Sinclair with 1 count of extortion and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty, the latter being a civil matter that could run parallel to the criminal proceedings. Linda was arrested at her home on a Wednesday morning in late March, after the snow had finally started melting, thin gray patches of it still clinging to the shadowed parts of the yards. She was booked and released on bail. The whole thing was in the local newspaper within 24 hours. On the HOA side, the board appointed an interim compliance chair, who was Gary Whitmore, because the room had voted for him unanimously, and honestly nobody was going to argue with that choice. Gary accepted with the statement that he would focus his efforts on the things the community actually needed, which got a laugh from everyone present. The Clearway contract was terminated with cause, citing the undisclosed conflict of interest. Northstar Grounds, the original competing bidder who had been passed over for Clearway 3 years earlier, was contacted. They were still operating and still very interested in the work. The HOA signed a new contract with Northstar for the following season. The regulatory investigation concluded that Linda had violated state HOA conflict of interest statutes in all 3 contract awards. The HOA was required to seek restitution from Clearway Property Services for the excess fees paid over the market rate bids, which amounted to a significant sum when you factored in 3 years of above-market contracts. Some of that money was recovered. Not all of it, but enough to offset the dues increases that had come in the past 2 years. As for Linda's criminal case, it eventually resolved in a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of attempted coercion and received 2 years of probation and a civil judgment requiring her to pay back a portion of the inflated contract fees as part of the HOA's recovery. She was permanently barred from serving on the Maplecrest Commons HOA board, which was the outcome the community cared about most. The fines. Sandra addressed the fines separately through a written demand to the HOA board, citing the improper citations and the lack of basis in the governing documents for several of the violations. The board, under the new interim leadership with Frank, Diane, and Gary at the helm, reviewed the past 3 years of fines. They reversed a significant number of them and issued refunds to the homeowners involved. Carol got her money back for the bird feeder and the wreath. Travis and Nadia got their basketball hoop fine refunded. Gary got his snowstorm fine refunded. And my 2 violations, both of which had been based on misread or invented rule interpretations, were formally withdrawn and removed from my homeowner file. I have to be honest with you. Getting that formal notice of withdrawal for my violations, the ones Linda had issued over the propane torch, was genuinely satisfying. Not in a petty way, or maybe a little in a petty way. I'm human. That piece of paper, the official HOA letterhead stating that the violations had been reviewed, found to lack basis, and were hereby withdrawn with apology, that was a good piece of paper to hold in my hands. I framed it. I put it in a little frame and hung it in my garage, right next to the hook where I keep my propane torch. There's something else I want to say, because I don't want this story to just be about winning an argument or getting revenge on someone who made my winter difficult. What I actually learned from all of this was about neighbors. About the people who live in these houses around mine. People I had waved at over fences and exchanged pleasantries with at the mailbox, but hadn't really sat down and talked to in any meaningful way for years. Walking those streets in the deep cold of January, knocking on doors, having those conversations, finding out that these people had been frustrated and worried and quietly wronged for years, that was genuinely moving. Gary Whitmore, who after everything became one of my favorite people in this entire neighborhood, told me over coffee one afternoon that he had almost sold his house the previous year because the constant fines and the stress of Linda's visits had made him feel unwelcome in a place he had lived for 16 years. 16 years, and a woman with a clipboard had made him feel like he didn't belong there. That made me angry in a deep, persistent way, not a hot anger. Just a steady, quiet recognition that it mattered to fight this properly and completely, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been sitting quietly under the weight of it. The neighborhood changed after all of this. Not in some dramatic, utopian way. People didn't suddenly become best friends or hold block parties every weekend, but there was a different quality to things. People talked more. When someone had a problem, they mentioned it to neighbors instead of just suffering alone with it. When the new HOA board sent out its first newsletter under the reformed structure, it included a page explaining the conflict of interest review process, how homeowners could request records, and how violations were now required to be reviewed by a 2-person panel before being issued. Those were real, structural changes, the kind that made abuse harder to hide. Winter finally released its grip on Maplecrest Commons in early April, the snow retreating slowly from the yards, the trees starting to bud out tentatively, the roads finally dry and clean under the weak spring sun. I replaced my old hose bib that spring, installed a proper frost-free model that sat 8 inches further into the wall. It was a straightforward job. I did it myself. Nobody sent me a notice. I still have the propane torch. It hangs on that hook in my garage, clean and properly stored, next to the framed withdrawal notice. Every time I see it, I think about that cold Thursday morning, crouched in the snow, doing a completely reasonable thing, and a woman in a purple coat marching across my yard like she was storming a battlefield. It's funny when you think about it. All of this started because Linda saw me thawing a frozen pipe and decided that was a problem worth creating. She had a notebook. She had a letterhead. She had the confidence of someone who had operated unchecked for so long that she'd forgotten the simple rule that applies to everyone, volunteer board member or otherwise, which is that eventually, if you keep pushing people around, you're going to find one who pushes back. And if that one happens to be organized, patient, legally informed, and surrounded by 64 equally fed-up neighbors, well, You're going to have a very bad winter. I had a pretty good winter, all things considered. Cold, sure. Plenty of snow. Roads iced over half the time. Frozen pipe, obviously. But I came through it knowing my neighbors properly for the first time, with a community that was genuinely stronger and more honest than it had been going into it. That's not a bad outcome for a Thursday morning in January. The torch is still there, hanging on its hook, ready for the next time the temperature drops and the pipes need some attention. Because this is the upper Midwest. There will absolutely be a next time. And if Linda Sinclair or anyone else ever marches across my yard to tell me I can't maintain my own house, on my own property, with my own tools, while the snow is still on the ground and the temperature is dropping and my pipes are on the edge of bursting, well, I know exactly where the recorder button is on my phone. I know exactly who to call. I know exactly which section of the governing documents to open. And I know 64 neighbors, at minimum, who will absolutely show up to a meeting in 17-degree weather to back me up. Stay warm out there.